My name is Agnes, and at 65 years old, I thought I had learned all the lessons life had to teach me. But last Christmas Eve, sitting alone in my Connecticut home, with a turkey growing cold and tears streaming down my cheeks, I discovered that sometimes the most painful moments can lead to the most unexpected revelations. I had spent days preparing the perfect holiday dinner for my son David and his wife Sarah, setting the table with my grandmother's china and polishing the silver until it gleamed. The house smelled like cinnamon and love, but by 9 o'clock that night, I realized I was celebrating Christmas completely alone. What I found the next morning in my bird feeder changed everything I thought I knew about family sacrifice and the mysterious ways love finds its way back to us. Before I continue with what happened that devastating night, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more real stories from life's unexpected turns. Because sometimes the most incredible discoveries come from our darkest moments, and I promise you won't believe what that little key unlocked. The morning of December 24th started before dawn in my little two-story house on Maple Street. I had been awake since 4:30, my heart racing with anticipation for the first Christmas dinner I would host since my husband Henry passed away 3 years ago. The kitchen became my sanctuary as I worked methodically through the preparations I had been planning for weeks. The 18-pound turkey went into the oven first, followed by the sweet potato casserole that had been Henry's favorite since we were newlyweds 42 years ago. I moved through the house like a woman possessed, arranging and rearranging everything until it achieved that perfect balance between elegant and welcoming that I remembered from my mother's holiday gatherings. The dining room table received my most careful attention. I spread out the cream-colored linen tablecloth that had been in my family for 3 generations, the one with tiny hand-embroidered holly leaves along the edges that my great-grandmother had stitched during the Great Depression. The good china came out of the cabinet where it had been gathering dust since Henry's funeral, each piece carefully washed and dried until it sparkled like fresh snow. Henry and I had started hosting Christmas dinner when David was just 7 years old, the year we bought this house, and finally had enough room for a proper celebration. For 31 years, this table had been the center of our family's most treasured memories. I could still picture David as a teenager rolling his eyes dramatically when I insisted on cloth napkins, or as a young man in college bringing home different girlfriends each year, and watching nervously as Henry grilled them about their intentions and future plans. Everything changed 5 years ago when David married Sarah. At first, I was thrilled to welcome a daughter-in-law into our family. Sarah seemed lovely during their courtship, always polite and engaged during family dinners. She laughed at Henry's terrible jokes and complimented my cooking with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. But something shifted after the wedding so gradually that I didn't notice it at first. The phone calls became shorter and less frequent. The visits grew more rushed, with David constantly checking his watch and making excuses about traffic or early morning meetings. Since Henry's death, the distance had grown even wider. David and Sarah moved to the city 2 hours away, ostensibly for better job opportunities. But I couldn't shake the feeling that geography was just an excuse for the emotional distance that had already formed. My son, who used to call me every Sunday without fail, now sometimes went weeks without checking in. When we did speak, the conversations felt stilted and formal, as if he were talking to a distant relative rather than the woman who had raised him. Last week, when I called to confirm Christmas dinner plans, David seemed distracted and distant. But he promised they would be here at 6 o'clock sharp, and I held on to those words like a lifeline. I had already bought his gifts, carefully chosen items that connected him to his father's memory. Henry's gold pocket watch, the one that had belonged to his own father, sat wrapped in tissue paper in my jewelry box. For Sarah, I had selected a delicate antique necklace from the estate sale of our neighbor Mrs. Whitman, something beautiful and valuable that I hoped would show her how much I wanted her to feel like part of our family. As the afternoon wore on, and the house filled with the rich aromas of roasting turkey and baking apple pie, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pure, uncomplicated joy. For the first time since Henry's death, I wasn't just going through the motions of living. I was creating something beautiful, preparing to share love and food and memories with the most important people in my world. The loneliness that had become my constant companion seemed to lift, replaced by anticipation and hope. By 5:30 that evening, every surface in my house gleamed with careful preparation. The turkey sat perfectly golden and ready for carving, surrounded by all the traditional sides that David had loved since childhood. Buttery mashed potatoes, green bean casserole with those crispy onions on top, cranberry sauce made from scratch with orange zest, just like my mother used to make, and warm dinner rolls that filled the kitchen with the smell of yeast and comfort. I had changed into my best dress, a navy blue wool that Henry always said brought out my eyes, and applied lipstick for the first time in months. The table looked like something from a magazine spread, each place setting, positioned with mathematical precision, 2 red candles flickering in the silver candlesticks that had been a wedding gift from Henry's Aunt Rose. Fresh pine boughs from our backyard evergreen tree created a simple but elegant centerpiece, their sharp scent mixing with the warm kitchen aromas. At exactly 6 o'clock, I positioned myself by the front window, watching the empty street through sheer curtains that needed replacing, but somehow looked festive in the soft lamplight. Cars passed by occasionally, their headlights cutting through the early December darkness, but none of them turned into my driveway. I told myself they were probably just running a little late, maybe stopped for gas or caught in traffic leaving the city. 6:15 came and went, then 6:30. I tried calling David's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail after just 2 rings. His cheerful recorded message, recorded years ago when he still sounded young and carefree, felt like a ghost from happier times. I didn't leave a message, not wanting to sound worried or demanding. Instead, I returned to my post by the window, smoothing my dress and checking my lipstick in the hallway mirror. The waiting gave me too much time to think, to remember the last time I had seen my son and daughter-in-law. It had been early September, nearly 4 months ago, when they made a brief stop on their way to visit Sarah's family in Boston. The visit lasted less than 2 hours, just long enough for coffee and stilted conversation about the weather and David's new promotion at the accounting firm where he had worked since college. During that visit, Sarah had seemed particularly distant, answering my questions with 1 or 2 words and spending most of the time scrolling through her phone. When I showed them the photo albums from David's childhood, hoping to spark some warmth and connection, Sarah excused herself to make a phone call that lasted the rest of their visit. David apologized for her behavior, explaining that she was stressed about work deadlines, but something in his eyes suggested the problem went deeper than professional pressure. I remembered calling Sarah directly the week before Christmas, hoping to coordinate what dishes to bring, or asking if there were any dietary restrictions I should know about. Her voice had sounded strange over the phone, clipped and formal, in a way that made me question whether she actually wanted to come at all. When I asked if she was feeling well, she responded with a curt, "I'm fine, Agnes," before quickly ending the call. By 7 o'clock, the candles on my dining room table had burned down noticeably, and the turkey was definitely overcooking despite my attempts to keep it warm without drying it out. I tried calling again this time, leaving a brief message expressing concern and asking David to call me back as soon as possible. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, but inside a cold knot of anxiety was forming in my stomach. The house felt enormous around me, every empty chair at the dining room table, a reminder of expectations that apparently weren't going to be met. I walked from room to room, straightening things that didn't need straightening, checking and rechecking the food that was slowly but surely moving past its prime. Outside, neighbors' houses glowed with warm yellow light, and I caught glimpses of families gathering around their own dinner tables, living the scene I had imagined for my own home. At 8:37 exactly, my phone buzzed with a text message. The sound cut through the silence like a blade, and I lunged for the device with desperate hope. But when I read the words on the screen, I felt like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. "Sorry, Agnes. Something came up last minute. Can't make it tonight." That was it. 24 words. No explanation, no apology that sounded like it came from a real human being, no acknowledgement of the hours of preparation or the emotional significance of the evening. Just a dismissive text message from Sarah sent like she was canceling a dentist appointment. rather than destroying Christmas for the woman who had raised her husband and loved him unconditionally for 38 years. I read the message 3 times, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense, something that showed even a trace of empathy or genuine regret. But the coldness of those words remained unchanged, each reading making them feel more brutal and impersonal. Something came up, could mean anything or nothing at all. No details, no promise to reschedule, no acknowledgement that this might be important to me. My hands trembling, I immediately tried calling both David and Sarah back. David's phone continued going straight to voicemail, but Sarah's rang and rang before eventually clicking over to an automated message. They were obviously together, obviously able to send text messages, but neither one of them could be bothered to speak to me directly or offer a real explanation for abandoning Christmas dinner. I sank into the kitchen chair where Henry used to read his morning newspaper, the weight of disappointment settling over me like a heavy blanket. The house suddenly felt cold, despite the warmth from the oven, and every carefully prepared dish seemed to mock my naive optimism. How could I have been so foolish to believe that things could go back to the way they were before? How could I have missed the signs that my relationship with David had deteriorated so completely? The rational part of my mind tried to find excuses for them. Maybe there really was an emergency, a sudden illness or car trouble that prevented them from coming. Maybe Sarah's text message was just poorly worded in the stress of the moment. But deep down, I knew this felt different from a genuine crisis. This felt intentional, like a decision, rather than an unfortunate circumstance. I thought back to all the subtle signs I had been ignoring for months. The way David's voice sounded strained when I called, as if he were looking for ways to end the conversation quickly. The way Sarah's responses to my attempts at connection had grown increasingly brief and cool. The way they never initiated contact anymore, never called just to chat, or share good news, or ask for advice. Sitting alone at my kitchen table, surrounded by enough food to feed 6 people, I finally admitted to myself what I had been refusing to acknowledge. I was losing my son, and I didn't even understand why. Since Henry's death, David had been my only remaining family, the only person in the world who shared my memories of birthdays and bedtime stories and family vacations. The thought that he might be slipping away from me felt like losing Henry all over again, except this time, the person I was mourning was still alive, but choosing to be absent. The tears started slowly, just a few drops, that I wiped away with the back of my hand. But once they began, they seemed to have a will of their own. Soon, I was sobbing into my hands, great heaving cries that echoed through the empty house and seemed to bounce off the walls and come back to me amplified. I cried for the dinner that would go uneaten, for the gifts that would remain unwrapped, for the loneliness that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me. But mostly I cried for the realization that somewhere along the way, without my noticing exactly when or how, I had become expendable to the person I loved most in the world. Christmas morning arrived gray and bitter cold, with that particular kind of stillness that comes after a snowfall. I had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and replaying every interaction I'd had with David and Sarah over the past year, searching for clues about where our relationship had gone wrong. By dawn, my eyes were swollen from crying, and my head ached with the kind of pain that comes from too much thinking and not enough rest. The house still smelled faintly of yesterday's feast, but now the aroma seemed stale and sad rather than welcoming. I forced myself to get dressed and venture outside for some fresh air, hoping the cold would clear my head and maybe provide some perspective on the previous night's devastating disappointment. Our small backyard looked pristine under its blanket of snow, like a Christmas card scene that mocked my current emotional state. I was trudging through the snow toward the bird feeder that Henry had installed on a post near our old apple tree when something unusual caught my attention. Tucked inside the covered feeder, alongside the sunflower seeds I had put out earlier in the week, was a small white envelope. At first, I thought it might be some kind of promotional material or advertisement that had blown in from somewhere, but when I pulled it out, I realized it was a handwritten letter addressed simply to Agnes, in careful, old-fashioned cursive. My heart started beating faster as I opened the envelope with numb fingers. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, the kind with watermarked edges that people don't use anymore, except for very special occasions. The handwriting was definitely feminine, written with what looked like a fountain pen in deep blue ink that had slightly faded at the edges. "Dear Agnes," the letter began. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you before. Check the old oak tree behind your garden shed. A friend who cares." That was all. No signature, no explanation of who had written it, or why they felt the need to communicate in such a mysterious way. But folded inside the letter, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was a small brass key. It looked old, probably antique, with an ornate head decorated with tiny engraved roses and a shaft that showed the wear of many years of use. I stood in my backyard, holding the letter and key, completely bewildered, but undeniably intrigued. The handwriting didn't look familiar, although something about the careful formation of the letters reminded me of my grandmother's generation, when penmanship was taught as seriously as mathematics or literature. Who could have left this message, and how did they know about whatever was supposedly hidden near the oak tree? The oak tree in question was ancient, probably planted 50 or 60 years before Henry and I bought the house. It stood in the far corner of our property, behind the small garden shed where we kept lawnmowers and rakes and bags of potting soil. Henry had always loved that tree, saying it gave the yard character and shade, and over the years we had raked thousands of its leaves and gathered its acorns for various craft projects when David was small. Walking through the snow toward the tree felt like embarking on some kind of adventure story, the kind David used to love when I read to him at bedtime. The mysterious letter and antique key added an element of intrigue to what had been shaping up as the most depressing Christmas of my life. Whatever was hidden out there, someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure I found it at exactly this moment. The base of the oak tree was surrounded by fallen leaves that had somehow avoided being raked up during my last yard cleaning session in November. I brushed them away carefully, looking for anything that seemed out of place or deliberately concealed. About 2 feet from the trunk, partially buried under a pile of leaves and covered with a thin layer of snow, my searching fingers encountered something hard and metallic. It was a small metal box, maybe 8 inches square and 4 inches deep, made of some kind of tarnished brass or bronze that looked like it had been underground for years. The box had a simple lock mechanism that looked like it would fit the key I held in my other hand. With trembling fingers, I inserted the key and turned it slowly. There was a soft click, and the lid opened easily, despite its obvious age. Inside the box, wrapped in what looked like oiled cloth to protect them from moisture, were several items that made my breath catch in my throat. The first thing I saw was an envelope with my name written on it, in Henry's distinctive handwriting, the same careful script he had used to address birthday cards and anniversary letters throughout our marriage. Seeing his handwriting again after 3 years felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave. I carried the metal box inside with hands that shook so violently I could barely maintain my grip. Sitting at my kitchen table with the mysterious contents spread before me, I felt like an archaeologist who had just uncovered artifacts from a civilization I thought I understood completely. Henry's letter was dated just 6 months before his death, written during the period when he was undergoing chemotherapy but still maintaining his fierce independence and his insistence on handling family finances himself. My dearest Agnes, the letter began in the formal style he always used for important communications. If you are reading this, then I am no longer with you, and you have discovered the emergency fund I set aside for David's future. I pray you never need to use this information, but recent conversations with our son have convinced me that he may face challenges I won't be alive to help him navigate. The letter went on to explain that Henry had been quietly setting aside money for years, skimming small amounts from his weekly poker games with his retired friends, and depositing them into a separate savings account that I had never known existed. The account had grown to just over $50,000 money that Henry intended as a safety net for David if he ever found himself in serious financial trouble. But what shocked me most was Henry's explanation for why he had hidden this fund from me during his lifetime. "I know you would have insisted we use this money for medical treatments or experimental therapies that might prolong my life," he wrote. But I made peace with my diagnosis long ago, and I would rather leave David with something substantial than spend our savings on futile attempts to buy myself a few extra months. This is my way of taking care of our boy, even after I'm gone. The savings account information was included in the letter, along with instructions for accessing the funds and transferring them to David when the right time came. Henry had even included a copy of the bank signature card, properly notarized and ready for execution. He had planned every detail with the same methodical care he brought to his job as a civil engineer, ensuring that nothing would be left to chance or bureaucratic complications. But there was a second letter in the box, and this one was not from Henry. The handwriting was the same careful cursive I had seen on the note from the bird feeder, and the signature at the bottom read, Eleanor Patterson, in flowing script. Mrs. Patterson, our 78-year-old neighbor, who lived in the yellow house 2 doors down and had been part of our community for longer than anyone could remember. Mrs. Patterson's letter was dated just 3 days ago, December 22nd, and its contents made my stomach churn with a combination of anger and heartbreak that was almost too intense to bear. Dear Agnes, she had written, I debated for weeks about whether to tell you what I overheard, but after watching you prepare for Christmas with such joy and anticipation, I cannot let you continue living in ignorance about why David and Sarah have been pulling away from you. The letter went on to describe a conversation Mrs. Patterson had accidentally overheard while David and Sarah were visiting me back in September. They had apparently stepped outside for privacy, not realizing that Mrs. Patterson's bedroom window was open, and that sound carried easily across our adjoining yards on quiet autumn evenings. According to Mrs. Patterson's account, Sarah had been pressuring David to limit his contact with me, claiming that I was becoming too dependent and would eventually become a financial burden they couldn't afford. She had expressed particular concern about my house, worried that David might feel obligated to move back home to take care of me as I got older, which would interfere with their plans to buy a larger house in a more prestigious neighborhood. Sarah told David that your house would be worth at least $300,000 if sold, Mrs. Patterson wrote, and she seemed very focused on making sure that money would be available to them sooner rather than later. She said that Christmas dinner was just another attempt by you to manipulate David emotionally and tie him down to obligations he couldn't afford. The letter described how David had tried weakly to defend me, mentioning that I had always been independent and wasn't asking them for anything except occasional visits and phone calls. But Sarah had apparently been relentless, painting a picture of me as a lonely widow who would inevitably become more demanding and clingy as time went on. She had even suggested that my invitations to family dinners were calculated attempts to make David feel guilty about not living closer. I could tell that David was torn, Mrs. Patterson continued. He loves you deeply, but he also seems afraid of confronting his wife directly. The conversation ended with Sarah making it clear that she expected him to choose between maintaining a close relationship with you and preserving their marriage. She said she wasn't willing to spend their weekends driving to Connecticut to humor an old woman's need for attention. The final paragraph of Mrs. Patterson's letter explained why she had decided to reveal Henry's secret fund and bring these issues to light. David came to see me 2 days ago, she wrote. He was crying like a little boy, saying he didn't know how to handle the pressure Sarah was putting on him. He said he wanted to come for Christmas dinner, but was afraid of the fight it would cause at home. I realized then that this situation needed intervention from someone who understood the whole picture. Henry left that money for David, but David needs to be free to accept it without manipulation or guilt. And you need to know the truth about what you're really dealing with. Reading Mrs. Patterson's letter felt like having puzzle pieces fall into place, creating a picture I had been unable to see clearly before. David wasn't choosing to abandon me out of indifference or cruelty. He was caught between his love for his mother and his fear of his wife's ultimatums, paralyzed by the impossible position Sarah had created for him. For the first time since reading Sarah's cold text message the night before, I felt something besides heartbreak and confusion. Anger, pure and righteous, flowed through me like electricity, giving me an energy and clarity I hadn't experienced in years. My son was being emotionally manipulated by a woman who saw me not as a person worthy of love and respect, but as an obstacle to her financial ambitions and social climbing. I spent the rest of Christmas Day formulating a plan with the same systematic approach Henry would have used to design a bridge or survey a building site. This situation required careful strategy, not emotional reactions or tearful confrontations that Sarah could easily dismiss or turn against me. I had advantages that Sarah didn't know about Henry's hidden fund, Mrs. Patterson's first-hand knowledge of the truth, and most importantly, a mother's determination to fight for her relationship with her child. My first call was to Tom Bradley, the locksmith, who had been Henry's poker buddy for 15 years and had helped us with various home security projects over the years. Tom was a straight-talking man in his 60s who had raised 4 children of his own and understood family dynamics with the wisdom that comes from experience. When I explained the situation and asked if he would be willing to serve as a neutral witness for a difficult family conversation, he agreed immediately. "Agnes, that boy needs to grow a backbone," Tom said with characteristic bluntness. "And that wife of his needs to learn some respect for her elders. You tell me when and where, and I'll be there to make sure everything stays civil and honest." My second call was to Martin Webb, the family attorney who had handled Henry's estate and had known our family for over 20 years. Martin's office was closed for the Christmas holiday, but he returned my call within an hour of receiving my message. After I explained Henry's secret savings account and the current family situation, Martin agreed to prepare the necessary paperwork for transferring both the house deed and the hidden funds to David immediately. "This is actually quite elegant," Martin said after reviewing the documents Henry had prepared. "Your husband was remarkably thorough in setting this up. We can have everything transferred within a week, and there won't be any tax implications since it's all staying within the family. But are you sure you want to give up your house, Agnes? That's a significant decision to make under emotional pressure." I assured Martin that this wasn't an emotional decision, but a strategic one designed to remove Sarah's primary source of leverage over David. If she was so concerned about accessing my house's equity, then I would give it to them freely, along with the additional financial cushion Henry had provided. But my generosity would come with conditions that would make it clear who was really in control of this situation. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and planning. I opened Henry's secret savings account and confirmed that the funds were exactly as he had described, earning modest interest for the past 3 years and growing to nearly $55,000. I met with Martin to sign transfer documents and establish a timeline for the property deed changes. I coordinated with Tom to ensure he would be available when I needed backup for the confrontation I was planning. Most importantly, I spent hours rehearsing what I would say to David and Sarah, practicing in front of the bathroom mirror until I could deliver my words with calm confidence rather than emotional desperation. This conversation would determine whether I maintained any relationship with my son going forward, and I couldn't afford to let anger or hurt feelings undermine my strategy. Mrs. Patterson proved to be an invaluable ally, sharing additional details about David and Sarah's previous visits and offering insights into Sarah's personality that I had been too hopeful to recognize before. "That girl has been calculating from the beginning," Mrs. Patterson told me over tea and homemade cookies on December 28th. "She's the type who sees every relationship as a transaction and every family gathering as a networking opportunity. But David isn't lost, honey. He's just confused and scared. Once he sees that he has choices besides surrender or rebellion, he'll find his way back to you." On December 29th, exactly 5 days after the Christmas dinner that never happened, I called David's cell phone at 9 o'clock in the morning. This time he answered on the second ring, his voice cautious and guilty when he heard my voice. "Hi, Mom," he said, and I could hear the weight of shame in those 2 simple words. "David," I replied, keeping my tone neutral and businesslike. "I need to come see you and Sarah this afternoon. There are some important financial matters we need to discuss regarding your father's estate. Can you both be available at 2 o'clock? The drive to David and Sarah's suburban development took exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes, during which I rehearsed my presentation one final time and tried to channel Henry's calm confidence in high-pressure situations. Tom followed in his own truck, maintaining a professional distance, but ready to provide support when needed. Mrs. Patterson had offered to come as well, but I thought her presence might seem like ganging up on David and Sarah rather than seeking resolution. David and Sarah lived in a modest colonial house that they had purchased 3 years ago with help from Sarah's parents for the down payment. The house was nice enough, but it represented exactly the kind of middle-class lifestyle that Sarah apparently found insufficient for her long-term ambitions. Every time I visited, I noticed new improvements or upgrades that suggested they were spending money they probably couldn't afford in an effort to keep up with neighbors who earned significantly more. David answered the door himself, looking haggard and nervous, in a way that immediately confirmed everything Mrs. Patterson had told me about the pressure he was feeling. My son had always been a gentle soul, more comfortable with spreadsheets and financial analysis than conflict and confrontation. Seeing him reduced to this anxious, guilty version of himself made my anger toward Sarah intensify, even as my heart ached for the impossible position he found himself in. "Mom, I'm really sorry about Christmas," he began immediately, but I raised my hand to stop him. "We'll talk about everything together," I said firmly. "Where's Sarah?" Sarah emerged from the kitchen, wearing a defensive expression that told me she knew this conversation wouldn't be as easy to control as she had expected. She was a naturally pretty woman, but her beauty was the calculated kind that came from expensive hairstyles and designer clothes that stretched their budget beyond reasonable limits. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who was trying very hard to project success and sophistication. "Agnes," she said with forced politeness, "this is unexpected. David didn't mention you were planning to visit." "I asked them both to be here for this conversation," I replied, settling into their living room with the kind of confidence that comes from holding all the cards in a situation. Tom took a position near the front window, close enough to observe, but far enough away to avoid seeming intimidating. I opened my briefcase and spread the documents Martin had prepared across their coffee table with deliberate care. Bank statements, transfer documents, property deeds, and copies of Henry's original letters created an impressive display that immediately captured both David and Sarah's attention. "I know about the conversation you had in my backyard in September." I began looking directly at Sarah. "I know about your concerns regarding my house and your fears about David feeling obligated to take care of me as I get older. I know about the financial pressures you've been putting on him and the ultimatum you gave him about choosing between his marriage and his relationship with me." Sarah's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally a kind of cold defiance that revealed her true nature more clearly than any words could have. "I don't know what you think you heard," she began, but I continued without acknowledging her protest. "I also know about the secret savings account your father-in-law established before his death," I said, turning to address David directly. $55,000 that he set aside specifically for your future security money that he hid from me because he knew I would have tried to spend it on medical treatments that wouldn't have saved his life." David's eyes widened as he processed this information. "Dad left money for me, but I thought the estate was just the house and his pension accounts." "Your father was a careful planner," I explained, handing him the bank statements and Henry's original letter. "He anticipated that you might face financial pressures or opportunities that would require resources beyond what you could manage with your current income. This money was his way of taking care of you, even after he was gone." As David read his father's letter, tears began streaming down his cheeks. Sarah, meanwhile, was studying the bank statements with the focused intensity of someone calculating exact dollar amounts and their potential impact on her long-term plans. "But there are conditions for accessing these funds." I continued pulling out the transfer documents Martin had prepared. "The same conditions that apply to my decision to sign the house deed over to you immediately, rather than waiting until my death as originally planned." This got Sarah's complete attention. "You're giving us the house now." "I'm giving David the house and the money," I corrected. "Both gifts come with one simple requirement. David must be free to maintain whatever relationship with me he chooses, without interference, manipulation, or ultimatums from anyone else. He gets to decide how often he visits, how often he calls, and whether he wants to include me in family celebrations. but those decisions must be his alone, made without pressure or threats from his spouse. The room fell silent, except for the sound of David's quiet crying as he finished reading his father's letter. Sarah was clearly struggling to process this unexpected turn of events. Her carefully constructed leverage suddenly transformed into generous gifts that nevertheless came with strings she couldn't control. Furthermore, I continued, if at any point David feels that he's being pressured to choose between his family relationships and his marriage, the house deed and the savings account will be transferred back to me immediately. The gifts are contingent on David's freedom to make his own choices about family relationships. Tom stepped forward at this point, his presence lending official weight to my words. Mrs. Agnes has had all the legal documents properly prepared and notarized, he said in his gravelly voice. This is all legitimate and binding. The young man gets financial security and property ownership, but he keeps his right to love his mother without permission from anybody else. The silence that followed lasted for almost a full minute, during which I watched Sarah's face cycle through a rapid series of calculations and emotional responses. She was clearly trying to figure out how to maintain control of a situation that had suddenly shifted completely out of her favor. The house and money she had been so concerned about were now being offered freely, but with conditions that eliminated her ability to use them as leverage against David's relationship with me. David finally looked up from his father's letter, his eyes red but clearer than they had been when I arrived. Mom, I don't know what to say. I had no idea Dad had done this, and I had no idea that you knew about... He glanced nervously at Sarah before continuing. About the things Sarah and I discussed. Your father was wiser than either of us realized, I replied gently. He understood that financial pressure could force good people to make choices that went against their natural instincts. He wanted to make sure you never had to choose between security and love. Sarah finally found her voice, but her tone revealed the calculating nature that Mrs. Patterson had recognized months ago. This is very generous, Agnes, but it seems like you're trying to buy your son's affection. Healthy families don't need financial incentives to maintain relationships. Tom snorted at this comment, but I maintained my composure. You're absolutely right, Sarah. Healthy families don't need financial incentives. They also don't issue ultimatums about which relatives their spouses are allowed to love. David will receive these gifts whether he chooses to have a relationship with me or not. The only condition is that the choice must be genuinely his. But what if he decides he doesn't want a close relationship with you? Sarah pressed, apparently looking for loopholes in my strategy. What if he's been visiting out of obligation, rather than genuine desire? Then I'll accept that decision and find ways to fill my life with other relationships and activities. I answered honestly. But I want to know that any distance between us is based on his authentic feelings, not on pressure from someone who sees me as a threat to her financial planning. David stood up abruptly and began pacing around the living room, running his hands through his hair, in a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was trying to work through complex problems. Sarah, did you really tell me I had to choose between you and Mom? Because that's not how I remember our conversations. Sarah's defensive posture became even more pronounced. I never used those exact words. I just pointed out that your mother was becoming increasingly dependent, and that we needed to think about our own future instead of constantly worrying about keeping her happy. But I wasn't constantly worrying about keeping her happy, David said, his voice growing stronger. I was enjoying my relationship with my mother until you started making me feel guilty about every phone call and every visit. She never asked me for anything except occasionally spending time together. She was manipulating you with guilt and loneliness, Sarah shot back. Every conversation was about how much she missed your father and how quiet the house was without family around. She was setting you up to feel responsible for her happiness. I had to bite my tongue to keep from responding to this characterization, but David stepped up to defend me himself. That's not manipulation, Sarah. That's just honest communication about how she's feeling. Mom never asked me to move back home or support her financially or rearrange my life around her needs. She just wanted to stay connected. The conversation continued for another hour, with David gradually becoming more confident in expressing his own feelings, and Sarah becoming increasingly frustrated as she realized her influence over the situation was evaporating. Tom's presence helped keep everything civil, but it was clear that fundamental issues in David and Sarah's marriage were being exposed that went far beyond their relationship with me. Eventually, David turned to me with a question that went straight to the heart of everything I had been hoping for. Mom, if I accept Dad's gifts and promise that I'll make my own decisions about our relationship, will you trust me to find the right balance? I love you, and I want you to be part of my life, but I also need to make my marriage work. That's all I've ever wanted, I replied, meaning every word. I don't need to be the most important person in your life, David. I just need to know that I matter enough to earn some small space in it. 6 months later, as I sit in my cozy one-bedroom apartment, just 15 minutes from downtown Hartford, I can honestly say that losing my house was the best decision I ever made. David and Sarah did accept the transfers, and true to my word, I placed no demands or expectations on how David chose to use his new freedom. The results have been better than I dared to hope for when I was sitting alone at that Christmas dinner table last December. David calls me every Sunday, just like he used to, before Sarah's ultimatums created distance between us. But now our conversations feel natural and relaxed, free from the undercurrent of guilt and pressure that had poisoned our relationship for so long. He visits every few weeks, sometimes alone, and sometimes with Sarah, who has gradually warmed to me once she realized I wasn't competing with her for control of David's life. Moving to a smaller space forced me to sort through 40 years of accumulated possessions and keep only the things that truly mattered. I donated boxes of Henry's clothing and old household items to local charities, but I kept his letters, photo albums, and the few pieces of furniture that held special memories. My apartment feels cozy rather than cramped, and the reduced maintenance responsibilities have given me energy to pursue activities I had been neglecting during my years of isolated widowhood. I joined a book club at the local library and discovered that I have strong opinions about contemporary fiction that other people actually want to hear. I started volunteering at a nearby nursing home, reading to residents who can no longer manage books independently, and found that sharing stories creates connections just as meaningful as blood relationships. I even took up watercolor painting, something I had always wanted to try, but never made time for when I was managing a large house and yard. Mrs. Patterson and I have become genuine friends rather than just neighbors, and we take small trips together every few months to visit local museums or historical sites that we never made time for when we were busy with family obligations. She was right about David finding his way back to me once he realized he had choices besides surrender or rebellion. But she was also right about something else. Sometimes the most valuable relationships are the ones we choose rather than the ones we inherit. The most surprising development has been Sarah's gradual transformation from adversary to something approaching a daughter-in-law I can actually enjoy spending time with. Once she realized that I wasn't trying to reclaim control over David's life or guilt him into moving back to Connecticut, she relaxed enough to let me see the qualities that attracted David in the first place. She's intelligent and ambitious and genuinely loves my son, even if her initial approach to family relationships was selfish and misguided. David seems like himself again for the first time in years, confident and relaxed in a way that tells me his marriage has improved, along with our family dynamics. He and Sarah used Henry's money as a down payment on the larger house she had wanted, but they also set aside a portion for David's continued education and professional development. They're planning more strategically for their financial future instead of just spending impulsively to project an image they couldn't afford. Last month, David called to tell me that he and Sarah are expecting their first child in the fall. Sarah got on the phone herself to ask if I would be interested in being an involved grandmother, and her invitation sounded genuine rather than obligatory. The idea of holding Henry's grandchild fills me with the kind of joy I thought had died with my husband, and I find myself looking forward to the future in ways I hadn't imagined possible during those dark months after his death. I think about Henry often, especially when I'm sitting in my apartment garden in the evening, watching the sun set over the city skyline. I believe he would be proud of the way I handled the crisis with David and Sarah, using strategy instead of emotion to fight for what mattered most. His secret savings account turned out to be more than just financial security for David. It was the key to unlocking honest communication and authentic relationships throughout our family. Sometimes the most profound gifts come wrapped in the most painful packaging. My devastating Christmas Eve taught me that love isn't about holding on tightly or demanding proof of affection through constant contact and attention. Real love means giving people the freedom to choose you, trusting that genuine relationships will survive the test of independence and autonomy. Mrs. Patterson still lives 2 doors down from David and Sarah's house, and she keeps me updated on their daily lives with the enthusiasm of someone who helped orchestrate a successful family reunion. She was the unlikely hero of this story, brave enough to reveal uncomfortable truths, and wise enough to understand that sometimes people need information before they can make good decisions. That little brass key I found in the bird feeder sits on my kitchen windowsill, now catching the morning light and reminding me daily that the most important discoveries often come when we're not looking for them. Henry's hidden fund saved more than David's financial future. It saved our family's emotional future by giving me the tools I needed to fight for love without compromising my dignity or self-respect. I learned that sometimes you have to let go of everything you think you want in order to get what you actually need. Giving up my house and choosing independence over security seemed terrifying at the time, but it turned out to be the path to genuine peace and authentic relationships. David didn't need a mother who clung to him out of loneliness. He needed a mother who loved him enough to set him free and trust him to find his way back. Christmas this year will be different from anything Henry and I ever experienced during our 42 years together, but it will be real in a way that feels more valuable than tradition or obligation. David and Sarah will host dinner in their new house. Mrs. Patterson will join us as an honorary family member, and I will bring my grandmother's china as a gift for Sarah to use in creating her own family traditions. The best part is knowing that everyone who gathers around that table will be there by choice rather than duty, drawn together by love that has been tested and proven strong enough to survive honesty conflict and the courage to change when change is necessary. What have you learned about the difference between holding on and holding tight? Have you ever had to risk losing someone in order to truly keep them in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it reminded you that love sometimes requires more courage than we think we possess. Subscribe for more stories about the unexpected ways families find their way back to each other, and share this with someone who might need to remember that the best relationships are built on freedom rather than fear. Thank you for listening to my story, and may your own family find the grace to choose love over control, understanding over judgment, and hope over resignation. Sometimes, the keys to our deepest happiness are hidden in the most unlikely places, waiting for the right moment to unlock the doors we didn't even know were closed.